This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest tonight, continuing our weekly series, is Dean Henderson. Dean, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Regis. Good to see you.
Well, we've been talking about for several weeks and in the past year about these global elite, these very small handful of people who basically control the entire world. Um, Tonight, I want to focus on what their agenda is for the United States of America. We've been connecting the dots. Everything that's happening around the world is not happening by coincidence, by accident, but according to plan. Everything. The one thing that you and I have not talked about specifically is how this group basically has control over the United States Congress, and everything about the society. So, Dean, I want to talk about some of these things, and I'd like you to um, explain what the purpose is when you look at them in an aggregate. First of all, ever since Bill Clinton started offshoring American industry, we've seen what is referred to as deindustrialization of the United States. We don't produce anything anymore. I want you to explain how they have infiltrated and affected our educational system, which once was an excellent educational system, but now some people are referring it to worse than third world. When we look at all of the social problems from drugs, sex, entertainment, pornography, we look at how we're all being forced into a herd mentality with the internet, telephones, social media. When we look at our election system, look at what's happening in Washington, D.C., completely dysfunctional. What comes out of Washington has been mostly to do with foreign policy, and I want you to explain how all of this is connected. Um, Dean, help us understand what is behind this and what the purpose is.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, the Crown bloodline, which is the elite that we're talking about, and they've always had this concept that you have to build up certain nations, tear down certain other nations, but you never want to build up a nation too high, and you never want to tear down a nation too low. And they know this from many centuries of plunder. So the United States obviously was the country that they built up post World War II, after Bretton Woods. But we're now in a stage where it looks like they're sort of tearing it back down, putting it in its place, and that's classic Crown behavior. You want to keep all your competition kind of sawed off at the legs just a little bit, and they've done that to Germany a couple times with World War One, World War Two. Germany, obviously, the engineering abilities of the Germans always kind of freaked these people out, so they had to cut Germany down a couple times with world wars and make sure that Britain was still the British pound was still the preemptive or the preeminent currency. After World War II, Bretton Woods Agreement made the U.S. dollar kind of the global currency, but you still can't help but notice the British pound is stronger than the U.S. dollar, which is still, to me, one of the most telling indicators of who actually runs the world. Simply who has the strongest currency, and that's the British pound. So this all started just to give people a little bit of history, a little context. Okay, so the United States was formed, 1776, Declaration of Independence, Constitutional Convention followed. There's a big bunch of Freemasons among our founding fathers, including George Washington and John Jay and Benjamin Franklin, and a lot of the prominent founding fathers were Freemasons. So there's a school of thought that says, or that sort of argues that the crown allowed the Americans to basically get their independence, quote unquote, from the British Parliament, but that they would remain under crown bloodline control from the City of London. So, and that this fight against King George, against the bloodline, um, as noble as it was, would end up leaving us, like I say, out of the purview of British Parliament system, but under the thumb still of the crown. Well, it didn't really work out that way for a while, but initially you had Alexander Hamilton, who was one of those Freemason founding fathers, who became the first Treasury Secretary under George Washington, arguing that we should have a private central bank. In other words, the same families who at that time controlled the European central banks, um, the families we've talked about before, the Rothschilds, the Habsburgs, the Bones, the Israel Moses Saifs, the Lazards, the Goldman Sachs, the Kuhn Lobes, cut into that picture later, the Rockefellers, should control a private central bank in the United States, owned by them, and they would lend us money to go to war and to run state programs and fund our government. Another line of thinking, which was headed by the Democratic Party at that time, Thomas Jefferson being their spokesman, but also John Quincy Adams, um, and the Democrats argued that no, we didn't want a private central bank. We wanted a publicly owned central bank, owned by the state and owned by the people. They were also the ones who argued that the people should be allowed into the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, whereas the Whigs or Republicans, at that time Republicans, said no, we should only allow the elite people, the aristocracy, to meet at the Constitutional Convention. They decide. We get to decide, what's good for the poor people, what's good for the farmers, and what's good for the people with not as much as we have, because we're smarter than they are. Wonder where they got that idea. So again, they were arguing bloodline control over, and really whether or not we'd have a democracy or not. So the Hamiltonians won out, and the Bank of the United States was formed. And it was a private central bank, and it lasted quite a while, 50, 60 years. During that time, there were many uprisings against it. Shays' Rebellion is one example. There was many examples of populist colonists rising up against the British throughout, and then finally the Boston Tea Party, all these things that occurred. But which with Boston Tea Party, by the way, was not an argument for cutting taxes. It was an argument for taxing the East India Company and its tea shipments to the United States, because they were cutting the throats of the local tea producers, chicory producers for coffee, different things. And so they wanted them to tax the East India Company, assess an excise tax. And so there was all these things. And anyway, Andrew Jackson came along, and Andrew Jackson was a populist, not a very nice president in a lot of other ways, led the massacre of the Indians, was tight with the Charleston Freemasons, at that, because Charleston was the sort of the beachhead of the Freemasons in the United States. Albert Pike was the head of it, and Jackson was tight with those guys. So, for whatever reason, he decided to go up against the bankers, and said that no, we should have a public bank of the United States, and he some of his quotes are just brilliant. Everyone should read Andrew Jackson's quotes against the banking cartel and how it was crippling the United States, because every time, they would spring a war. There was talk about nationalizing the bank, and okay, here comes the war of 1812, and they just spring a war on us, and they, you know deplete our munitions, deplete our fuel, deplete our resources through war, and then they come along and borrow us money and, sink us into debt. So when Andrew Jackson was president, and when he actually made it a public central bank for a time, it was the only time the United States was not in debt in its history, the only time, before or since. So that lasted a while, and then Lincoln issued his greenbacks during the Civil War, which was also sponsored by the bloodlines because they were mad about this public bank. And so Nicholas Biddle, the Treasury Secretary at that time, was a Rothschild, tool. August Belmont was another one. They named the Belmont Stakes horse race after him, part of the Triple Crown. And all the Rothschild representatives in the papers and the banks were basically insinuating that Abraham Lincoln was this hick and this hillbilly, and that he wasn't very smart, and that, this is why he was issuing this, his greenbacks. He called them greenbacks. So he was started to pay his Union soldiers in greenbacks instead of U.S. dollars, because he was trying to get outside of the Bank of the United States private bank Rothschild control system. And so, yeah, sure enough, here comes the Ford Theater, and he's assassinated by another agent of the Rothschilds, a member of the Golden Dawn Society, as it turns out. And so they killed him. They killed Abraham Lincoln. The Crown killed Abraham Lincoln using their lone gunman, their surnamed lone gunman assassin, who and all these generals from the South eventually escaped to Britain to go into exile, that were generals for the Southern Confederates. So the Confederates were squarely backed by the bloodline, by the British Empire, by the bad guys, and they were just trying to tear away part of the United States, a particularly resource-rich part at that time, thought of as the most resource-rich part, although they hadn't made it out west yet. The Spaniards had, and they knew that. But so this whole thing goes on, and Lincoln's assassinated, and here comes the second Bank of the United States shortly on its heels. And in 1870, they formed the United States Corporation, and they made corporations out of every state. So the Crown essentially has made a corporation out of every country now in the world. I've seen documents that say the state of Israel is a corporation registered in the city of London. And there's documents of this kind about every country, because to the British Crown, again, this bloodline, this sovereign world controllers, they believe they run everything, and they don't really recognize democracy or elections. They just recognize that we're a subsidiary of the Crown Corporation. The United States is a subsidiary of them. So in 1870, that happened, and that was huge. Then come the robber barons, the era of the robber barons, and that's what made that possible. So the Morgans, the Vanderbilts, all the railroads, again, funded by the Crown, funded by the Rothschilds, and the Bank of England and the Bank of France, and now the Second Bank of the United States, all Rothschild banks, funded the railroads, funded the Western expansion, the ongoing genocide of the Native Americans, like we talked about last time. And so concentration of wealth was great. It rivaled anything that had occurred up to that point in this country, and exceeded it really. So that occurred, and then 1913, particularly bad year. The Federal Reserve was born, and officially brought into officialdom was this private central bank, which is no more federal than Federal Reserve. It's a private held corporation owned by the banks. The bigger the bank, the more stock it has in the Federal Reserve. It's just that simple. And then you have a federal, an open market committee that pretty much runs the makes the policy decisions, and the only federal part, the only government part of the Federal Reserve is the Board of Governors, which is appointed by the executive branch. But these are also just bankers, and so it's really at that point it doesn't matter if it's public or private. They're working for the private sector interests for the banks. So the Federal Reserve came into play. A few years before that, the Rockefeller family funded the General Education Board, which was this kind of manifesto about, again, how the East Coast, Wall Street, Eastern Seaboard elites who worked for the crown were going to educate the dumb hillbillies in the interior, and how all they needed was a chance, and it was just this really condescending. It was called Occasional Letter Number 3, I think, and it just the way they explain this way they're going to basically fund and handle and approach public education is just sort of like a roadmap for how to dumb people down. And it was all about, if you came from a certain class, maybe you should be a tradesman, and we should keep the intellectual pursuits to the upper class, and keep the ruling government positions to the upper class. And everyone should read that Rockefeller General Education Board Occasional Letter Number 3, I believe it is. But there was all these things coming out at that time, similar bent, similar mindset. So right off the get-go, now that they had the United States as a corporation, as an official subsidiary, they wanted to dumb the people down right away. Because if you're going to use a country like the British have used the United States, and the way they've used us is, again, as a Hessianized mercenary force to protect their global interests, then you have to dumb down the population, and you have to keep them distracted and entertained. And that's why you see the crazy things you see in the United States, and the reality TV shows, and I don't know, just everything, the circuses, the parades, any kind of distraction that can take people away from reality, and sort of make them feel good about this role that they're playing, which deep down, I think every American knows that we're just totally being played, So, yeah, 1913, Federal Reserve comes along. That was a meeting at Jekyll Island, well documented and discussed. The Warburgs were involved really close with that. And that made it official. That was a very interesting time, because this is when the Business Roundtable, which again we talked about last time, which John Coleman talks about in his excellent book, Committee of 300, was meeting right at the same time and dividing up the world. And this is right when the Federal Reserve was born. This is right when the Russian Revolution occurred, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. This was right when the Balfour Declaration was issued. First stating the claim of the state of Israel would be formed down the road, and it was. Treaty of Jeddah followed that closely, creating the Saudi GCC Emirates, carving that out of the Ottoman Empire. So all these major geopolitical moves occurred in the 19 teens and 20s. And this led up to another consolidation of power globally, in the hands of the bloodline, of course. And this led to the Roaring Twenties in the United States. And this led to the crash of 1929. And of course, Goldman Sachs formed the Shenandoah Trust and the Blue Ridge Trust. And they allowed Albert Wiggins, the Citibank CEO, and the Chase Manhattan CEO, and all these big shots and all these families to get out of the stock market a year ahead of the crash through these different mechanisms. And so they did not get hurt. And then they crashed the market. Coming out of the crash in the 30s, FDR was elected by the people. FDR was not a natural populist. His wife was a Delano, which is a bloodline family. It's a very powerful family. He was also a 33rd degree Mason. And, the Masons are the ones that carry out a lot of the political machinations. But he was kind of forced by the Wobblies, by Eugene Debs, socialists, and by just a generally surly feeling American working class, to push forward with this New Deal, which, rural electrification, civilian conservation corps, works progress administration, social security, a lot of things that we have in the United States that are a safety net for the people, unions, occurred then. And that wasn't, again, because FDR was such a great guy. It was because he was a rich guy that was forced by the American working class to do what we needed to be done. Otherwise, there would have been a revolution. There would have been big problems. There would have been not peace, something else but peace. So he did all that, but at the same time, he called in the gold and he declared the U.S. bankrupt again. And so this is the bankruptcy of the United States occurred then, and there's a whole another offshoot of thought that we probably don't have time to get into today, but how at that time they basically monetized everyone's birth certificate in the United States, and they began as collateral for the debt, for the bankruptcy. They called in the gold, so that was to be held as collateral for our debt to the crown, to the Rothschild Federal Reserve Bank now. And B, they would monetize our birth certificates and they would trade them on the New York Stock Exchange. So anybody born, your birth certificate's in capital letters. You're basically a subsidiary of the United States Corporation. You're not a human being. Of course you are, but to them, you're just a subsidiary of the United States Corporation. And your birth certificate is traded in your entire life, and you are basically social credited and economically credited or debited according to how you behave. So if you make too much strawberry jam at home and you don't buy it from Smucker's, you probably get demoted. You get poor marks. Seriously, I mean, this is how they look at it. How much do they buy? How much do they consume? How willing are they to work for us for nothing, be slaves? And then there's other people who don't do any of that, and they don't like us. They don't like us. So that happened in the 30s, right? But still, we had this populist movement. FDR was in. We went into World War II because of Pearl Harbor, which was a false flag created by the British intelligence, and Winston Churchill convinced us to come in and save the city of London from the Germans. Not such a great idea, but we did crush Japan, and Japan was bad, and that needed to be done. The Yamato Empire went a little nutty, the bloodline, and they thought, they came out in the open and said they were, white supremacists, and they were going to conquer all of Asia under the Asian prosperity sphere. And they did the massacre at Nanking, China, and we had to do something. So that's okay that we did that, and that's okay that Hitler's gone too, obviously. But the bad part about World War II was it left the city of London intact as the power center. And that's when the United States should have weaned itself from the city of London, since we did all the heavy lifting. Actually, the Russians did all the heavy lifting as far as taking care of Hitler. But I mean, as far as saving London, we did that. And we should have come out of that Yalta conference on Stalin's side instead of Churchill's side. And it's just that simple. And that was a huge mistake the United States made. Because of the crown agents, because of the influence, that was pressuring our government as usual, and portraying Stalin as evil, and we were great, and the British were so sophisticated, and the whole thing. But that was our chance to really go with the Russians and get rid of the city of London, but we didn't do it. And so you come out of there and you get this kind of neo-colonialism forms. So you have the IMF forms, International Monetary Fund, World Bank system. And that system replaces the overt colonialism that the French, the Belgians, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, all the colonial powers, they practice open colonialism in Africa, Central America, Latin America, Asia. So now they had a new system. So they had all these countries declare independence, and it was great. And we were supposed to think that was such progress. But the only thing that happened was, instead of just sending British administrators to Kenya or Belgian administrators to the Congo, and having the white people run the country directly. They turned it over to black rule. They bought off a couple of families in those countries, and but they allowed the blacks to openly rule, and so they gave it a good, pretty face. Oh, they're running their own show. Really, they are. In the meantime, in the background, the IMF is loaning money to those countries. The families that are in favor get a cut. The Western corporations owned by the crown become the contractors for the so-called development, and they get the money. That's where the money goes, but it gets debited to the countries. So the countries are sunk into debt. They get really nothing. They might get a road, they might get a water system, but the money itself is going to these powerful corporations. And then after a while, those countries, when they get too far in debt, they'll say, "Oh, sorry, we have to take that public water system that Bechtel Corporation built, and now we have to privatize it because we have to pay off this huge debt that your country has irresponsibly accumulated, even though it was this crooked family and these crooked corporations who accumulated that debt." And so this just became the new neo-colonial system. And part of that system in Africa was these national parks, because after the Kennedy assassination, and Kennedy was also killed by the crown because he wanted to establish a silverback currency to counter the Rothschilds' U.S. dollar system. But anyway, after that, they realized they needed a new cause. They needed to give the Western activists a new cause because they were really worried that people were asking so many questions about the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission and the fact that, J.P. Morgan Chase and Allen Dulles ran the Warren Commission, the very people that were involved in Kennedy's murder. And so they went off and said, we're going to do environmentalism, this thing called environmentalism. So they started all these parks in Africa. The G7 of the environmental movement, I call them. It's like Sierra Club, Defenders of Wildlife, National Wildlife Federation, those kind of people, Nature Conservancy. They're all controlled. If you look at it, this is where, King Charles, when he was Prince Charles, he was like the head of the WW, the World Wildlife Federation. And all these crown families sit on the boards of these environmental groups. And so they diverted a lot of attention, a lot of activist attention into this environmental movement. And of course, we all want to save the environment and live in a clean world and all this stuff, which of course they don't actually, because in their actions, they actually trash the environment every day. They're still doing it. And then they come out with smart electric washers that use less water, but them things run for like an hour and a half. So they'll use a lot more electricity, but they're flying the flag of greenie, and same old waster colonial mentality, right? So they diverted a lot of people. They stole a lot of land in Africa. They displaced a lot of African tribes by forming these parks. They did the same in the United States, forming wilderness areas, displaced a lot of people in the United States. A lot of indigenous people said, this is total crown think, people can't live with the environment. They'll ruin it automatically because that's just the way people are. But of course, it's not the way people are. It's the way the crown is. And we're nothing like the crown. We don't just go out and trash the environment. Most people aren't like that. So they created this environmental movement as a diversion for activism to keep it kind of off the rails. They created this new system of colonialism, yes, to keep the world deindustrialized, to keep the third world. And then you come to about the 70s and 80s, and you get Reagan and Thatcher. And Reagan and Thatcher, I would argue, were the beginning of the end for the height of maybe Western civilization, we could say. Definitely the height of the standard of living in European and Western countries, because they were all about austerity. So what comes with neocolonialism, always guaranteed, you can it's like a clock, you can predict it. It's always going to be austerity. It's always going to be, okay, we control you. Here's some good stuff. Here's some progress. And now, oops, you owe us money. And now here comes the austerity. Here comes the privatized water system. Here comes Mexico, 1995. We'll just take your railroad system because, the Mexican debt crisis, and we have to help you and get you out of this. So we'll just have Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan just kind of take your railroad and we'll just put it over here on the board. And that'll be ours now, your public railroad system, which used to take people and passengers everywhere in Mexico. There no longer is a public passenger train in Mexico, sadly, because it's all controlled now by Burlington Northern, BNSF, Union Pacific and the big U.S. railroad cartel. So that's how they handle that, and that's how they handled us. And Reagan and Thatcher said, "Oh, the government's too big. We got to cut the government." And this began this sort of, it's still ongoing. It's still ongoing, even with Alex Jones and people in the alternative media. It's still ongoing. They just can't get enough privatization. They can't have enough control by the rich. They want more control by the rich. They want to wipe out more government. They want to charge user fees for more public things like national park trailheads and public libraries and things that were just automatically public. Now they want to know, they got to have a contractor come in, probably a crown contractor, and make some money off of that government agency. So it really just, what it was the British mercantilist system creeping into America and eventually becoming the official policy, which is that we would use private contractors, always crown controlled, private contractors to administer our government. So it was the knocking back of the government part and the increasing of the private contractor part, and the influence and the control that these private contractors have over our society. And again, all these private contractors end up being crown corporations, such as Serco, which is the biggest, and that just gives them more and more control over our government, obviously, because they're the ones bidding the contracts. They're the ones telling the government agencies what to do this, and give us a contract for it. This is our recommendation, and they do it. And of course, most of these government agency people don't realize that the crown is lurking in the background, that there's an ulterior motive going on here even. They just have become now used to this system. But that's the system, and Reagan really and Thatcher really brought that into the UK and the US, and then it was Clinton and Bush and the Bushes that really catapulted the power of the City of London forward in an even bigger way, and Tony Blair, because he deregulated the City of London even more, gave it more autonomy, more independence to do whatever it wanted. Reagan had allowed U.S. corporations for the first time to trade to take U.S. dollars overseas and put them in banks. Before Reagan, you could only, as a U.S. corporation, you could only use U.S. dollars to buy or sell a product overseas. And there was no holding in a foreign bank account. You couldn't do that. So Reagan, during that era, came the advent of the euro dollar. And a euro dollar is just, could be any currency held in a jurisdiction other than its own. In other words, if a euro is being traded in Panama, it's a euro dollar. If a US dollar is traded in Panama, it's a euro dollar. And it's just this, it creates this offshore network, opaque network, without regulation, without any oversight, no eyes on it. And this became the offshore banking network. And this was another part of the new world order, the new colonialism. So you have the IMF, World Bank element, get the third countries into debt, third world countries. You have the privatization aspect where you privatize the Western governments, everything they do. And then you have this offshore banking aspect where you form the euro dollar. And once you do that, there gathers this huge pool of money, dark money, trillions of dollars of dark money. And as I said in the last interview, all of these offshore banking jurisdictions are controlled by the Bank of England in the City of London. They all funnel back to there, and that's who has jurisdiction over them. And nobody can know who owns those accounts except the Bank of England, because there's numbered accounts at the Bank of England, and those accounts are then held wherever. Doesn't matter. Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Bahamas, Vanuatu, Liberia, Seychelles. There's all kinds of these places, and they're everywhere. So rich people use whatever's close to them, and somehow that ends up back in the City of London. So it's perfect for smuggling oil money out of, say, Iraq. Say, let's meet a corrupt Iraqi family. Let's go up against the revolutionaries and let's steal their oil. or same in Syria, which the U.S. has done a number of times recently, just stolen Syrian oil. And the Iranians have howled about it in the Strait of Hormuz and threatened to shoot these ships, and sometimes taken in these ships, these pirate ships that are basically stealing oil from Syria and giving it to ExxonMobil so they could take it to the refinery in Curacao. So all this happens now with the Eurodollar because you can, the dirty oil money, the dirty drug money, the dirty human trafficking money, human organ trafficking money, all that stuff has a place to go now, and it's called offshore banking. So nobody can know where it came from, nobody can know where it's going, and this is what really creates the paradise of corruption that we saw in the Panama Papers, that we've seen over and over throughout the years and through different entities that have popped up, different reports that have popped up. So this is another way you deindustrialize a country. You take the dollars, the strength of that country, the money, and you let its corporation tentacles controlled by the crown suck the money out of the United States from the people who paid the corporations for the goods, the services, whatever. We're paid for commodities in the case of farmers. Then you let Cargill and these companies take it out. So you just take all this wealth out of the United States and put it all around the world, and not just the United States. They do this everywhere. We were just kind of the last to see this happen. And what's that do? Obviously, you're depleting a country of its foreign reserves. You're depleting a country of its investment for the future, its ability to invest in infrastructure, ability to fund government programs. And so, of course, they don't want government. Of course, they don't want our money to go to us. They're parasites. They're pirates. This is a parasite class. They can't stand the idea that our own labor would be rewarded with the fruits of our labor. I mean, no, our labor goes to them. Our labor, we're slaves. Our labor, they skim off the top and they take what we make and they get that. Because that's the way these things think that aren't human. And this is not a human concept. And this is why we're at war with these people. This is why we're in a low intensity warfare with these people and have been for 40, 50, 100 years, maybe 8,500 years. Those of us who know, because we know they stole our money. We know they stole everybody's money, way back to the Indians, way back to the blacks enslaved in Africa, and right up to the present day in the case of offshore banking and our money. And all this, go to China, pay them $1 a day, deindustrialize further, create these trade agreements. Another big prong in this strategy was all these free trade agreements, which weren't free at all, except if you're the crown. Then it's a free lunch. It's a free lunch. It's not, you didn't do anything. We did everything. We did the work. We did the heavy lifting. And you get what? You get, special, So this whole thing has been a scam. And then Clinton and Bush just came in and they made it even more of a Wild West. And this was the official point where the Democratic Party sold its soul to corporate America and you could never trust them again, was Bill Clinton. Because after that, the Democrats were never the same. The Democratic National Committee was never the same. And there was no point being a Democrat anymore. And I'm not anymore. I'm an independent now. But before that, it was a working class party. And then before that, it was the slaver party. And then before that, it was way back, it was the party that opposed the Bank of the United States. So that's just a kind of a short history. And where we're at now, maybe kind of a long history, but where we're at now is yes, we're being deindustrialized. Yes, we have $34 trillion in debt, 34 trillion to who? To the Rothschilds, to the Habsburgs, to the Bourbons, to the Plantagenets, to the Goldman Sachs, to the Rockefellers, to the Lazards. This is who we owe the money. And then a little bit to the Chinese, a little bit to the Japanese, a little bit to the Saudis and Kuwaitis, sovereign wealth funds, but not much. Most of it, this is another myth. They talk about, we're in debt to China. No, we're not really. We're in debt to the families. We're in debt to the bloodline families. That's who we're in debt to. So get it right, don't lie. Have some courage. Tell the truth. That's the truth. That's the truth. About 30 trillion of that is owed to the families, and 3 or 4 trillion is owed to sovereign wealth funds, countries. We should pay those countries off in full. We should cancel the rest of it, and we should nationalize the Federal Reserve, and that's the answer. And then we have no debt. then we have the ability to pay our way, and which we should do from that point forward, just like any family should do. Don't get credit cards, pay your way, pay cash, pay everything. What you have, pay it. Like that. Responsible, be responsible. Or Peter Tosh said, pull your own weight, man. Pull your own weight, man. It's not some novel concept. This is a law, a natural law throughout human history that you have to do. You have to pull your own weight and be responsible. And if you get in trouble, we shouldn't have to bail you out. And that goes for governments, and that goes for billionaire, trillionaire families too. We shouldn't have to bail you out, man. Just because your hedge fund went into the ditch, we shouldn't have to give you trillions of dollars like we did in 2008 and bail these banks out and get nothing for it. This is the kind of shit we do because we're bent over slaves. And this has to end. We have to stand up and say, no, it's going to be this way now. This is how it's going to be. It's going to be running according to natural law. And but yeah, that's kind of where we're at, and now of course they're trying to take us into this fourth industrial revolution, this cloud this cloud that they're going to take us into. It's not working out too good. There's a lot of technological glitches. They didn't have the stuff down like they thought they did. They tried to really bring it all in full force during the COVID lockdowns. That's what the lockdowns were all about. Put up more towers, get people shopping at home, on the internet, knock out the bricks and mortar stores of the competition, any small store, while the big stores were left open to gouge the people, and they're still gouging the people. But it didn't really work because we backed off the Fauci Colonna family. He works for the Colonna family, one of the bloodlines. We backed off the Fauci elf, his minions, and his masters, and we backed off to some degree this fourth industrial revolution. And then of course now we have sanctions on Russia, and they have all the nickel, the uranium, and so yeah, it's going to be kind of difficult to make electric cars this dream come true for everybody without nickel. Kind of common sense again. We run into common sense, so that's not going well. And now here they are pivoting to Ukraine, pivoting to Israel, trying to salvage their military industrial complex one more time because their attempt to try something else failed. And they have to go back to that because why? Because it's a big money maker. Because the crown contractors, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, British Aerospace, Grumman are making mint off of this, and they will continue to make mint as long as we're at war. We're funding parties that are at war. So the only way out of this trap is nationalizing the Federal Reserve. That's where it starts, and basically dissolving the United States Corporation of 1870 and getting real independence. So that's what we as Americans, anyway, should be shooting for.
Okay. I wanted to dig a little deeper into how it all works and who it all works, and we'll talk about that on another show. For example, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, they were actually trained by, worked for the crown, and they actually were the ones who determined foreign policy. They advised the presidents, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and there are others now that are doing the same thing. But with the time we have left, you just alluded briefly to why FDR created and went forward with the New Deal. You said it was because he'd have been thrown out of office. There'd have been a revolution.
Mhm.
I want to talk to you now about what you've been saying. We need to nationalize the Federal Reserve. We need to take back a federal bank. Uh, how's that going to happen? I mean, the crown is so powerful. We've seen that. You've made that abundantly clear in show after show after show. Um, Seriously, do you think elections can change anything? I mean, this next election we've got coming up is probably one of the greatest sideshows. It is a sideshow that we're ever going to witness. So, what can bring that about, Dean? Is there any hope?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. The answer is I don't know. But I'm going to go forward and keep moving forward and keep going in that direction because that's why I'm alive in this world and that's what I have to do. Okay. So everybody else can decide what they have to do and what they should be doing here. But there's no guarantee. Look, it's going to have to come from the people. It's going to have to come as a movement. It's going to have to come as a Occupy Wall Street type movement that's focused on nationalizing the Federal Reserve and getting the United States out of debt and liberating us all from the shackles of debt. Because you pay your taxes, you're pretty much paying the interest on the debt, right? So whether or not you believe your stock certificate's traded on the New York Stock Exchange or not, you're in peonage either way. I mean, you're paying off the debt of the reckless behavior. You're paying off the debt of that we gave to Raytheon Corporation to bomb Ukraine yesterday, to provide arms to Ukraine. You're paying that off. You didn't incur the debt, but you're paying it off through your income taxes. And so there just has to be an organic movement. No, we're not going to be able to count on politicians. Ron Paul was the last person to talk about this in the halls of Congress. There's nobody talking about it anymore. Dennis Kucinich talked about it a little bit too, but nobody anymore. Okay, if Bobby Kennedy, somehow upsets the apple cart and wins the election, who knows? But all I know is we need to start talking about it. I mean, how do things get done if you don't start talking about them? We tend to kind of think, oh, we'll just all sit back and let the politicians do their thing, and they'll magically do it or they magically won't, and that's just not the way politics works. It's not the way it's ever worked. There's always political pressure required to get what the people need. Always. That's just the nature of the beast that we're up against. And they're not going to give you anything. They are not going to do anything in your interest. Okay. You have to demand it and you have to form a movement and you have to go get it. And so that's what it's going to take. It's going to take an organic movement. But my job, as I see it, is to elevate the conversation to a level where we understand what we're asking for and why we're doing it. And to me, there's no better thing to ask for than the nationalization of the Federal Reserve. To put that under a Treasury Department, to issue a currency printed and issued by the bank, by the U.S. government. Okay. You can do all kinds of things once you just do that. You can do low interest loans to poor people. You can do low interest loans, zero interest loans to Indian tribes, and to people in Harlem or people in Compton, poor neighborhoods. You can target things much more easily. There won't be any redlining from banks because there won't be any banks involved. This is the government now being the bank. You can still have your private bank, on the side, credit unions, and if you want, smaller banks, but you have to take out the upper echelon. You have to take out the Wells Fargo's, the JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America. Those banks will need to be shut down, repossessed, and the assets redistributed among the shareholders, the American people. We're the shareholders. They stole the money. They owe us. This is the inversion of the Luciferian inversion of a lifetime, where these banks can be reckless and somehow ring us up on a $34 trillion tab that we owe them. I see. That's pretty rich. So actually, it's just the opposite. See, you owe us about $34 trillion as a country. So you will go ahead and you will forfeit your assets, and we will strip you of your assets if you will not forfeit them. And if you will not forfeit them, then we will fine you and throw you in jail until you do forfeit them. And this is how it's going to be. No, we can't do that. That's socialism. Well, then you're fucked. If that's the way you think, if you're that brainwashed from the Cold War, if you're that retarded by hundreds of years of indoctrination and miseducation, then you're fucked. You're not. If you're going to live on your knees, you're going to be a peon. You're going to be a slave. Sorry, but if you want to talk about real, then you have to talk about socialism. You have to talk about expropriation of assets from people who expropriated the assets from you. Understand? It's like, we didn't start this. We didn't ask for this. We didn't go stealing their stuff and putting a piece of paper. You owe us this money now. We stole your stuff. Now you owe us this money. We didn't do that. They did that. But how sick and perverted is that? That you're a parasite on somebody and then you're a parasite on them again. It's just unbelievable that people put up with this shit. Unbelievable.
So,
So I'm
Dean,
ready for that to change. And really honestly, it's up to the people because the temperament of the people right now is not good. The temperament of the people is very cowardly and it's not standing up. And until the people change their hearts and souls, and until the people decide they're not going to be like this anymore, they're not going to pussyfoot around all these issues and worry about the words they say and how they say them, and if they're going to get shadow banned, and if they're going to get slammed off the internet, and if their uncle's going to hate them at Christmas dinner or whatever, then things aren't going to change. But if you want things to change, they're going to change. Man, it's just that simple. It's like Bobby Kennedy said. They said, you can't win the election. How can you win? He said, I can win if you believe I can win and vote for me. Right? I mean, if everybody votes for him, he wins, right?
yeah, but
Bingo.
Dean, do you really think elections are going to change anything?
Doesn't
I don't
matter what
care.
I think. Though it doesn't matter. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't matter what I think. I'm going to do what I'm do. I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to vote for Bobby Kennedy. That's the best I can do, even though I don't like some of his Israel stuff. Doesn't matter what I think. It just matters what I do. But instead of sitting back and being all cynical and saying, "Do you really think? Do you really think?" It's like, let's just do it. Let's just make it happen.
But
And
don't you
and if
think?
enough people do that, it'll happen. But if most people are just going, "Oh, I don't think it's going to work anymore," then it's not going to work anymore. See, this is what I mean. Like they beat us down so bad that we have no hope, that we have no belief in ourselves, that we don't even know the power we have to change things anymore. And sadly, we've lost that, and that we had that in the '60s, '70s. There was revolutions all around the world. There was countries rising up. Look, that's still happening in Mali. It's still happening in Niger. It's still happening in Senegal. It's still happening in Sudan. It's just but the Western people have given up because they're fat and happy. They eat too well. They have too much stuff, too much money in the bank, and that just gives them a ticket to sort of say, oh well, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. I'm not desperate. I'm doing fine. I'm eating 3 squares a day, and that's really sad. We cannot settle into that mindset. We cannot settle into that mindset because we have the blood of the world on our hands if we do. But I'm afraid we have.
Yeah, I want to get back to elections again. And you mentioned Bobby Kennedy, and that you're going to vote for him. I'm of the opinion that elections are part of their agenda. They make us think that change can
Okay.
happen, but if we look back over my lifetime, nothing good has happened for me, for the rest of Americans that came out of elections. And if Bobby did get elected and he tried to do the things that he's doing, they're going to kill him just like they did to his uncle, just like they did to his father. Uh, and in Coleman's book, he talks about Kissinger. He said sarcastically, Kissinger wasn't worthy of assassinations, but they orchestrated that whole thing to get rid of him because he screwed up their plan. So you talked about movements, and I was very heavily involved in Occupy. Like so many people, we believe that we are the 99%, and the government crushed that. Now, and we alluded to this before, there's just this movie that's coming out in the spring, and the trailer is going all over the place. It's called Civil War, armed conflict between the people and the United States government that turns the United States military on the people. Um, I think you and I both know there are, well, people in America can have guns, and many people do. Many people have assault weapons. Um, I don't know. I suppose many people even have things like grenade launchers and bazookas, and you know, uh, who knows what they might have now. But when you say that people are unhappy, and I agree with you, but I don't see a movement right now uh,
No.
that has taken any kind of shape or form. But we are hearing and reading in a number of places that we're in a civil war, but we're just not shooting yet. This movie that's coming out, I'm wondering if it's to precondition the American people about what they want to have and us killing each other. I mean, what are your final thoughts on that? Because I don't know.
No, yeah,
I agree with you. I think it has to be massive, continuous, worldwide, peaceful, saying no, peaceful resistance in the streets, not willing to go along with it anymore.
yeah.
Anyway, your thoughts.
Well, I think they are conditioning people for civil war. I think this is why you have Trump somehow being associated with the alt right. Um, this is why you have the over the top transgender stuff, the over the top climate stuff, because they want a backlash. They want a backlash against the transgender people, against climate things, and they just want to drive each other crazy, and they want to take us to civil war, because that, again, you have to keep America cut down at the knees. You have to keep it culturally depraved. You have to keep it stupid, and you have to keep it divided above all else. So they won't pay attention to the people at the very top, which is what obviously is the solution. We unite together from all different sides and angles, and guns and no guns, and peaceful and not peaceful. Militant's fine with me. I'm not, I'm not sworn to peaceful myself. I'm sworn to justice. No justice, no peace, really, because that's where I'm at, and I can work with anybody, and I don't care, and so that's where we have to be, and we're going in just the opposite direction, because social media has created two camps of hive-minded people who think they're so different from each other, Republicans and Democrats, and in fact, they're pretty much the same. They're pretty much subservient to corporations in different ways, and they like to be victims. So this has to change, but yeah, but we get into that more next time. I guess I better run. I gotta get on my horse here. I got another something to do here in a few, but we're just getting into the thicket. So we'll continue this in the next show, I'm sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to end on this note. They have been using fear and divide and conquer for centuries. Centuries. They've perfected it. It works. There's no need to try to find anything else. Dean, thanks so much. We'll look forward to seeing you again, if not before Christmas, after Christmas.
Okay, and if not, Merry Christmas.
Same to you, my friend.
Okay, bye bye.